Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring messages from soldiers in the afterlife. My guest is Jonathan Beecher, who is the founder of White Crow Books based in the United Kingdom. In that capacity, he has edited and republished many books detailing the work of some of the best spiritualist mediums of the 20th century. Also, using the pen name J.R. Archer, he is the author of the novel, largely based on factual accounts of parapsychological experiences, A Dog's View of Love, Life, and Death. He is also the editor of the newly published anthology, In Times of War, Messages of Wisdom from Soldiers in the Afterlife. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. So welcome, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Nice to meet you, Jeffrey.
You've had an interesting personal experience that led you to found the company, White Crow Books, and to edit this new book, In Times of War.
Yes. Shall I talk a bit about that? Shall I?
Yeah, let's start by getting into your own story. I think it's fascinating. As I recall it began when you took a nasty fall. You were sleepwalking.
Yeah, I'm told that's not possible, but all I know is I went to bed one night with some friends. We went to a dinner party. We'd been drinking a bit, but no more than another night. And the next thing I knew, I woke up and I was on the floor, and my wife woke me up. I was unconscious, and she found me about 5 or 6 in the morning, whenever it was. And basically, I somehow walked across the room or something while I was sleeping and landed on my face, and I smashed my front teeth in. My jaw, my lip was severed. I had to have 30 stitches and my jaw was broken on both sides. And I have no idea what it was about. And I was lying on the floor, but so I was a mess, but not in any pain whatsoever, which was kind of strange. And I didn't think too much of it at the time, because I just thought it was something that happened. Everybody said, I was probably drunk or something the night before, that kind of thing. And I had to have 6 weeks off work because my jaw was all wired up. I was running a record label at the time, an independent record label in London. And so I was sitting at home for 6 weeks. And literally after a day or so, I thought, I'm going to start writing a journal, which is something I'd never thought about before. But it was the best thing I ever did, because I ended up writing, for the next few years, hundreds of thousands of words, just how I felt. Because and it was shortly afterwards I realised something had happened, and it took me a while to work it out. But something had happened. It was like I'd woken up and felt completely different to how I went when I went to bed. Like I'd had a software update or something like that.
So you think it happened literally overnight? Because it occurred to me that the 6 weeks you spent in recovery with, I gather, your jaw wired so you couldn't even talk, might have also been a very influential factor.
It could have been. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't. For me, it was very disconcerting. It was seriously disconcerting. Because I was. You wake up and you're feeling over the next couple of weeks. I remember because I started writing things down. That's what was interesting, because you can remember stuff from years ago and you think, did that really happen, or is it a false memory? But if you're writing things down, it's very interesting. And I was writing things down. Like the first day, I was having odd dreams, and I don't remember ever having dreams. I know we always have dreams, but I never remember having dreams since I was a child. And I was having, and I just felt different to the day before, if you see what I mean. I mean, I guess it was definitely a before and after situation, although it did take a while. It took me quite a long time to work it out, because at first, because I just felt it was as if everything in my life beforehand was irrelevant, basically.
you describe your life before this accident as basically a materialist. I don't know if you were an atheist or not, but you weren't particularly drawn to spiritualism at all.
I was an atheist, absolutely, I would think so. But I wasn't really, I mean, I grew up with my mother and my stepfather. My stepfather was an atheist. My mother was, secular. There was no religion in the house, no Bible, nothing like that. We never went to church or anything like that. I was christened, but I wouldn't have my children christened, for instance. My son, I wouldn't have him because I thought it was mumbo jumbo. And but I wasn't anti it. It wasn't anything like that. And I certainly had no knowledge of people who have spiritually transformative experiences or near-death experiences or spiritists or mediums or anything to do with psychic. I had no interest and no knowledge of any of it. So no, that's true. Which is why it's disconcerting.
Well, but more things began to happen. You began receiving messages from a spiritualist medium.
First of all, I started feeling very different. Like, I had no fear of death. Not that I ever really thought about death. I mean, I was almost 44 years old, so I didn't really think about it too much. I was in the music business. I was flying around the world. I had a couple of children with two marriages. Living the life, traveling in and out of America and Australia and all this sort of thing, having fun and ups and downs like everybody. But I definitely wasn't didn't really think about it. But all of a sudden I had this different feeling, as if it was very strange, as if this wasn't home kind of thing, as if I was somehow connected to something greater. And, I had this physically I had this high-pitched whistle in my head, which I still have to this day, which I'm sure if I went to a doctor, they'd say it was tinnitus or something, and I could hear my heart beating, and there was some weird things physically like that. But the way I felt was, and suddenly I felt I was sort of plugged into some, a lot of friends of mine thought they didn't think I'd gone mad, but they couldn't really understand what happened, because one day I'm like this, I used to hunt, go shooting pheasants and game and things, and we always did it in the winter. And this happened in October, so by about December I was healed up, and my pal called me and said, we've got some shooting days booked in January, and I said to him, I can't go shooting. And he said, why not? I said, well, I can't shoot an animal. He said, well, why not? You've been killing him for years. And I said, I don't know why not, I just can't do that anymore. And so he didn't understand.
That's a major change.
Yeah, I couldn't, but I couldn't understand why. And within a couple of years, I couldn't eat meat anymore. I just couldn't. The idea of it repulsed me, even though I've got 2 dogs and I feed them meat. But I haven't eaten meat or anything like that for way back then. I started doing voluntary work. I never thought. I didn't know anybody that did voluntary work and all this kind of thing. And I was just and my business. The most important thing for me was the business that I was in. I'd co-founded a couple of record companies. I'd been in it for nearly 30 years. I had just no interest in it. It was almost if it was a bit of a game. It wasn't really interesting, and then what happened was, I think the thing you're referring to. So I was writing this. But I was writing all the time. I was writing, and I was experiencing precognitive dreams. I didn't even know what a precognitive dream was, and all this sort of odd things happening like that. And then about 18 months later, maybe I was writing this journal one night. I started writing and about how I was feeling. And on this particular night, I'd now become very interested in death. Not in any morbid sense. It was just, I didn't think death, to me now, in my newfound, post head-banging state, in my newfound, it was as if death there was no such thing as death. Obviously, death of the body, but it was nothing. So obviously, it wasn't anything negative. So I was writing one night about, I always had a lot of coincidences back then, beforehand even, but I now would call them synchronicities, I guess. But back then, and on this particular night, I was writing a blog about how I'd made decisions in life and people had died as a result. And it wasn't sort of a guilt thing. I was just observing why that was. So, for instance, when I was 21, I was managing a clothes store, and I had to hire a guy, and then he didn't work out, and I had to fire him, and he went home and hung himself, and which was very traumatic, as you can imagine. And it turns out his father came to see me the next day. I was 21 years old, and he told me he he was a schizophrenic. He'd been in hospital for 6 months, and he made me feel better about it. But it was a strange thing. And then what happened was, I had this in 1988. I had this friend of mine who died in my house. So on this particular night, I was writing about whether if I'd have taken him to hospital or made a different decision, whether he could have, whether I could have done anything about that. He was split up with his girlfriend. He came to stay with me. He'd been out drinking one night. The bar owner brought him home, brought him back to my house, delivered him at 2 a.m. in the morning. Delivered him drunk. Brian, his name was, and so I put him on the sofa because he wouldn't go to bed, and put a cover on him. And then I was about 31 at the time. He was 33, and I was there with a girlfriend of mine. And the following day, on the following morning, he was laying on the floor, and he'd been sick, and he was moaning, but he wouldn't. I was trying to get him to go to bed, but he wouldn't go to bed. He just wanted to lay as if he was wanting to sleep it off, if you like. I thought he just had a terrible hangover. He'd been sick and everything. So I left him there and went to see my parents. So when I came home with my girlfriend, he was dead. So that was in 1988, and then another thing happened. Like 2 or 3 months after that, we used to fly around the world a lot, and we used to have freight companies always offering us tickets for flights and things. And I was feeling, after my friend died, it was a terrible time, because it was I had to tell his parents and all this kind of thing. And anyway, a couple of months later, one of these freight companies offered me some tickets to go to New York. And I was in the company. We didn't take the tickets because we never wanted to favour the companies. But this time I thought, I'll take them. So I said, yeah, okay, I'll have those. 2 tickets for New York in December. This was in September, the same month. So my friend died a month before, in 88. Anyway, about a month or so before the flight, I decided I didn't want to go. I don't know why. I'd flown, I don't know how many times I've been on planes, but many, many times. And it was the only time I decided I didn't have tickets for a flight. I didn't go, apart from I remember missing a flight in America once. And anyway, that plane was the Lockerbie flight where everybody got killed. The Pan Am flight that got blown up. So going back to 18 months after I've had my bang on the head, I'm writing one night. I'm writing about this and going, does this happen to people normally? There's 4 people I can think of who, you made a decision, didn't go on a plane, fired a guy, didn't take the guy to hospital, and they died. So I was asking the question, I suppose, writing to my friend, saying to my friend Brian, could I have done anything? Not, as I say, not the guilt feeling, it was just an observation. Anyway, 3 days later, my sister called me at midnight. She was a very normal kind of girl, and I was a normal kind of guy, and she was very nervous about calling me. It was very late at night, insisting that I should talk to a friend of hers, a school friend of hers' wife, who she'd been talking to, who called her because they were desperate to talk to me. The wife was desperate to talk to me. And it turned out I called this woman, and it turned out the wife had been to see a medium because her grandfather had died. And halfway through the sitting, she said someone came through for John. Her husband was called John, mine called John, common name, and his name was Brian. And this John was connected to her. And she'd never heard of anyone called Brian, so she went home and told her husband, about all this message. She didn't understand any of it. And he said, oh, well, my friend Nikki, my sister, her brother, John, me, had a friend called Brian who died in his house. So that's why she wanted to talk to me. So I called her, she talked to me. And she said to me, bear in mind, she's never met Brian. He's like a drop-in kind of guy. But she'd never met Brian. And she said, and I've never met this woman. And she's telling me, and she's been to see a medium. So she wasn't a medium. And she said to me, oh, your friend has a message for you. He said that you've been thinking about him in the last few days, which is true. I've been writing about him, something I hadn't done for years, because he died this is 2002, and he died in 88. And he says that whatever you think, it's his time to go. You couldn't have done anything about it, which throws up philosophical connotations to this day about the time to go. Yeah. And then she described what he did for a living, that he was a jeweller, he was tall with blonde hair, etc., etc., etc. And this went on and on and on. And that kind of, if you like, piqued my interest that something was going on. And then I started reading the literature, and then I started realising this bang on the head I'd had. There was a lot of people who had these kind of experiences. And then I ended up going to see a medium and so on and so forth. And I then went on a different path.
I'm presuming it was this experience and others like it that led you to become the founder of White Crow Books.
What happened with that was I didn't plan. I was quite happy being the founder of a record company. and it was much more profitable, by the way. So I was very happy doing that. But this whole, I then started going. I then visited a medium a year later because I couldn't understand. I was trying to debunk what had happened. I didn't believe in any of this stuff. But I couldn't understand how I could have a conversation with a woman that a dead friend of mine could come through the sitting 3 days after I'd been writing about him and answer a question that I asked and various other things. So I couldn't understand that. So then I went and saw a medium a year later and had hugely evidential reading. Lots of them. There've been many of those. 4 books were those. What happened was, and then after that, I lost interest in all my job and business. So when the time came, I just left. But then I had to figure out what I wanted to do, and I was now embroiled in this "what's the nature of reality" kind of thing. So I made a documentary with. I decided I had to do something. I wasn't independently wealthy. I wanted to do something, and I was reading all these books. And I decided to make a documentary. And I met Gary Schwartz, Gary Schwartz, University of Arizona. And we made a documentary about a precognitive guy called Christopher Robinson. That was interesting. We made it in Arizona. And then after that, I was reading all these books and reading all this life after death literature. And meanwhile, I'd left my business and they put me on gardening leave because they didn't want me to go. So I went off to America and I went to a remote viewing conference and I met Ingo Swann and Russell Targ was there and Paul Smith and all those guys. I went on a Monroe Institute gateway for a week. I went to a physical seance in White Plains in New York. I was doing all this stuff and reading all this stuff. And eventually I thought to myself, I quite like all these old books that were out of print and everything. And I thought, and I started releasing them, and then, and it went from there, really, and that's why here I am.
See. Well, let's talk about your book, In Times of War. It really attracted my attention because long ago, when I was a college student, I had a mentor, Arthur M. Young. He was actually the man who invented the Bell helicopter, and after inventing the helicopter, he took a big interest, as you have done, in the paranormal and traveled to England. This would have been back in the 1940s. He met Lord Dowding personally, about whom you've written. So he told me these stories of Lord Dowding, and then I saw for the first time, really, since then in your book. So why don't we start there and talk about Dowding? He's, at the time, during the Second World War, one of the most prominent men in England.
Born in the 1880s, I think. I'm not an expert on Dowding. I mean, how I got to know about him was he married a woman called Muriel Dowding after his first wife died, and she was a vegetarian and anti-vivisectionist and all this kind of thing, quite a well-known woman in England. And years later, she had a son, and Lord Dowding brought him up, kind of thing. His name's David Whiting. He got in touch with me to say that his stepfather's books have been out of print for years, and someone said he should talk to me. And so I started reading these books, and basically Dowding was, in World War II, he was quite old. I guess he would have been about 45 or 50 or something like that. And he was the air commander, or the commander. I'll probably get picked up on this for his job title, but in the Battle of Britain. So while the Battle of Britain was going on, between him, he was probably one of the most famous people in the UK, aside from Winston Churchill. And but he apparently, his wife had died sometime before, and into Clarissa, I think, and he went to a seance, basically, and I think that's where he met his second wife. And then he had lots of evidential kind of sittings. He started reading a lot of the books that I found I was reading later on as well. And then he set up a rescue circle where he was kind of helping people who had died and ostensibly didn't know they died. And I'm sure in the history books he's probably not very well known for that, because I'm sure people probably thought he'd probably gone off the rails. But I don't think he'd gone off the rails at all. He spent his whole life dedicating to finding out the truth, the nature of who we are, and yeah. So he's no slouch. If you know what I mean. He was a fascinating character.
I understand his title was something like Air Marshal. He was in charge of the Royal Air Force.
That's right. I mean, when they made a film in, I think it was 1969, called The Battle of Britain. Laurence Olivier played him. Laurence Olivier was the theatrical actor in the UK, and what was interesting about his books, I thought, was that he, basically he's talking about the experiences he had, the And he's got this group of he's got this rescue circle. He's sitting with these mediums, and there's all these dead airmen who were part of his crew, sort of following him around and trying to wake up other airmen and people who've died and not knowing they've died. And so it's fascinating. If you and of course for me, having had a lot of experiences by now, and also had this sort of head trauma and feeling very differently, had some kind of spiritually transformative experience, and then I could fill a book with really interesting stuff from very evidential stuff that I had from reading. I could, if you like, buy into Dowding because I had the same experiences, and for me, it wasn't about sort of any weird belief system. It was just, if you get all this information from people who profess to die. I mean, I don't know, when you get very specific, detailed information that other people could not possibly know, which I've had lots of, I'm sure lots of other people have, and you know that it can't be the person sitting in front of you, then you have to conclude that there's something going on. I will say, if my dead grandfather got in touch with me, which he did, and told me his name, and I didn't even know his name, I don't know if it's my dead grandfather. It could be a pink frog pressing a button. We could all be simulations. What I do know is it wasn't the person in the room, so therefore my materialist, atheist worldview was wrong. Mm-hmm. And so Dowding was kind of similar so I empathise with him really. And then what happened was end of last year, I was listening to, I think Donald Trump had just pronounced they were going to leave the mid-range nuclear weapons treaty, and he was, and then Putin at the same time made some speech, very, very religious almost speech, where he said, if we get attacked with nuclear weapons, we'll become martyrs in heaven, and our enemies won't have time to repent. I'm thinking, oh my God, and I was reading about all this stuff, and I was thinking a lot of people, and I was thinking about Dowding's work and other books that I've put out, where people who've been at war and they've died, and how it affected them after they died, and what state they found them in. And I just started writing and putting them together, because I thought that was fascinating.
Now, you mentioned that Dowding formed a rescue circle. Can you define what a rescue circle is?
Yes, well, the explanation for a rescue circle is that many people die, and after they've died, they don't realise they're dead. And they might be in a very negative state. So the theory is, if it is it's not even a theory, is it? The idea is that they're at a very low vibration, that we're at a low vibration. When we die, we go to a higher vibration, but they're a very low vibration, and therefore people who would be helping them on the other side, if that's the best way to say it, can't reach them, and therefore they're more easily reached by people here. So you get these groups that have been going on for years, certainly in the UK and all over the world, who sit for years in service, if you like, helping people. So the medium will communicate, and they'll speak to let them know that they've passed over and help them move on. And these groups are all over the country even now. I've met a few of them over the years, and they don't charge. There's no money changes hands. They do it for years. And Dowding set up one of those, and where they were in the idea to help people.
In other words, Dowding worked with a medium.
Yes.
He would be speaking to the spirits of deceased soldiers by talking to the medium, and the soldiers would speak back to him through the medium.
Yeah, the medium was in trance, and he would be explaining to them that they weren't in Germany. Let's say they were in Wimbledon, which is where he was sitting, and he would, and he'd help them move on. People bring them in, and it's a well-known tradition, I believe. And so that's what he would do.
So in Dowding's writings, there are many accounts then of deceased soldiers who would come. They didn't even know they were dead, but they would often provide many details of the battles they had been in.
They would provide details. He would try and explain to them how. What I found interesting was they're quite often talking about their state of mind before they died, and then the state of mind after they died, and how they found themselves, and what they could see, and what they could feel, and what they could hear, and how their beliefs really affected their beliefs when they were alive, affected their environment when they're dead, after they died, sort of thing. Which is interesting. Which is what I guess religion has been telling for thousands of years. But So he would converse with them, and then he would have this bunch of people on the other side, if you like, who would be bringing these people in, a bit like Carl Wickland. Yeah. He was interesting because he was bringing people in the 1930s or early 19.
Wickland was a very prominent psychiatrist.
Yes. Yeah. Well, you probably know more about him than I do, but he was interesting because if you think I thought what was interesting about his book, 30 Years Among the Dead, his wife was a medium, and that's how he became to experience it, if you like. And he had people. I thought it was interesting that we just had the anniversary of the Titanic, and William Stead, who was a prominent journalist who died on the Titanic. But I thought he was interesting because he had some abilities, psychic abilities, automatic writing, that kind of thing. And I thought it was interesting that 20 years before the Titanic in 1892, Stead wrote a novel about a ship called the Majestic was sunk, and the captain on that ship in his book was, I think it was Edward J. Smith or whatever his name was, and it was the exact same name, including the initial of the Titanic captain 20 years later. So you can imagine, I was thinking about that, can you imagine, you've got Stead, William Stead, who is the journalist, who writes a book, maybe it was inspired, and he names the captain on this ship that hits an iceberg called the Majestic, owned by the White Star Line. And then 20 years later, he steps onto Titanic, and you can imagine that the captain probably came and said, I'm your captain, my name's Edward J. Smith, or it's the same name. He had to thinking, my God, I wrote about this 20 years ago. It was a premonition. I mean, that must have been kind of. But he came through after he died, supposedly, to Wickland and brought people to him who were in trouble. Exactly the same as Dowding was doing 30, 40 years later.
As I understand it, one of the passengers that came through was Jacob Astor.
Well, yes, because Wickland wrote in his book, people came through, and he abbreviated their names because families were still alive. But yeah, JJA, I think, which you call him, or John JA. The only John JA was Jacob Astor, who was on the Titanic. And it's interesting if you read, I use it in my book. If you read when John Jacob A comes through, if you like, to Wickland, if you read what he says, and then you go and look up what he was like. It's very, it makes a lot of sense, and that's another example. I mean, he came through to Wickland in 1916, but he died in 1912. But he was still cold, wet, and not really knowing where he was. So this idea that what it tells to me is it's probably quite useful to have an idea about what might happen when you die, even if nothing happens. There's nothing to lose by just having an idea, because he was a good example of someone who was in this kind of hellish state, apparently, as a lot of them are, because he spent 4 years, and was 4 years as we measure time, and didn't really know where he was or what he was doing. Mm-hmm. And so, kind of the same as what Dowding was saying when people were coming through to him. You get soldiers coming through, and they get very philosophical, because they're talking about how they felt before, how they felt afterwards. There was one guy that came through to Dowding, and he was a Norwegian. He said that he lived in England, I think. He spoke good English, and he was a shopkeeper, and the Germans had killed him. And he said that, he couldn't forgive the Germans. He said he could never forgive the Germans. He's dead, bear in mind. He said he could never forgive the Germans, but at the same time, he knew that by not forgiving the Germans, he couldn't move on. He was stuck in this kind of frequency, vibration, whatever you want to call it. And so they say a lot of things like that, which I find quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. You point out in your book that these stories go back actually to the time of Plato.
Yes, well, there was the story of Air, I guess, wasn't it? I think it's or Air, where he was. That was one of the early ones that was recorded. Plato recorded in a conversation with Socrates, who basically had what we might call I guess you call it a near-death experience. They describe how he goes off to another place, how they have judges, how they and how he's told that he's not being judged now, but he has to go back to Earth, if you like, or to his life to report and let people know that there are consequences and all this kind of thing. And then there was another one guy in the 7 Years' War in the 1700s, 1762, and he was interesting because he clearly was very sick and had a sort of near-death experience, nearly died. And while he was in a stupor, he met a doctor who he knew on the boat, and it turned out the doctor had already died. So that was, for him, that was a good evidence, because otherwise how could he have known that the doctor had already died? So there's plenty of these reports. There's plenty. There seem to be many.
From 1762, where was that one reported?
In America, because I think he was stationed in America on a boat, and he talked about that the British had. He was an American, I think, and he talked about that the British had settled their affairs with Spain and France, but they would be coming after us, the Americans, next, which obviously did happen a few years later. So, and the interesting, whether you go back, obviously they're in a different vernacular, but whether you go back to the Vietnam War with Bill Vanden Bush, I mentioned him, or Lord Dowding, or the situation, the language is very different, but the situation people find themselves and what they say about the consequences, if you like, for what you believe in, and how you find your environment after seem to be very similar.
Well, one of the common themes that you report is that soldiers in particular, after they die, they're often shrouded in a kind of darkness, and this darkness is in effect a projection of their own thought forms.
It does seem to be the way. It does seem to be the way. It seems to be, if they're in a more negative place, let's say, not so much for what they've done, I mean, who knows, but for what they say is, if they've been in negative states, whatever they believe. For instance, if they believe nothing happens when they die, they spend a lot of time in a state of no-thingness. They spend a lot of time experiencing nothing, blackness, whatever you want to call it. And so if they believe they're going to be, so consequently, whatever they think they're going to experience, they experience, which is not all good, by the way, but not all bad either. So and they're in a confused state, and but at the same time, there are a lot of them report who were quite normal guys, mostly guys, obviously in that war, who had just been killed. They weren't particularly religious, but they may have been. But they kind of had half an idea. They were obviously wondering if they were going to survive, and they weren't that surprised when they did survive. But what is interesting is how they find out how they struggle to control where they are. So, for instance, one of them, the Polish guy, he talks about that he's with people that he likes now. He's with people, and he knows he should go back to Poland, if you like, project himself back to Poland and help people there who've died. But he's worried that if he projects himself back to Poland, he won't be able to get back to where he is now. So it's almost they're in a kind of, well, I guess what they say, they're in the astral plane, whatever you want to call it, where whatever you think manifests.
Another fascinating case you report on involves President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his personal secretary.
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, that was a famous, well-known back then Irish medium called Geraldine Cummings, and I think she'd met a guy called David Gray, who was I guess he'd be the ambassador in the UK or something like that. And they were sitting one day, and an entity, a woman, came through who identified herself as Marguerite DeHand, who was Roosevelt's PA, who died. And she was trying to get through to David Gray to tell him that the president was going to be coming over any day now, and which of course he did a couple of days later. And then an entity comes through who sort of identifies himself as Roosevelt, who talks about the food that he ate, and he talks about how his funeral, that no one could see him, but his dogs recognised him. His dog Scotty, I think it was, recognised him and rolled over and this kind of thing. So it was quite compelling. A lot of these stories are very compelling. I mean, the medium Geraldine Cummings the woman coming through, who was Roosevelt's secretary, talked about her replacement, who was someone called Botenga or something. Lots of interesting things that she probably wouldn't have known. As I say, for me, the reason why I can be open to these things, because I've had so much of my own stuff come through, so I know it happens. I don't know how it happens. I don't know who's communicating, but it happens.
Well, it seems as if when you go through all these reports, what you get is quite a smattering of evidential material. Information that comes through that the medium certainly wouldn't have known, and it checks out and it's accurate. But more than that, you get descriptions of what the afterlife is like for these people. And given that it includes some evidential material, I would think those descriptions are worth careful study.
There was the guy, Edward Randall, who was the lawyer from American Lawyer. And I think the interesting thing about some of those early reports, I think they still exist today, but those early reports is it seems like that back then, because there were probably less distractions, and they were able to, like Randall, for instance, met a lady called Emily French, who was a direct voice medium, which is a very unusual, rare, apparently, gift, if that's the right word, where she would sit in a darkened, darker the better, but not a pitch black room, a darkened room, and voices would manifest in the room that didn't come from her. And so Randall was a sort of trial lawyer apparently, and he heard about this woman. She was quite an elderly lady, and so but he wanted to make sure it wasn't all fraudulent, because obviously a lot of those things lead themselves. So he invited her to his house where he had a circle. They all seemed to have a circle back then, and they did 700 sittings. She never took any money. And of course, once you've got over the initial, Uncle Bob's here, he died 5 years ago, hi Uncle Bob, I love you, you love me, that kind of thing, then they start talking about how they find themselves. And the interesting thing is they all find themselves in different environments. I think that's interesting. But, I can picture it that you and I, Jeffrey, were driving down the road and we're in a car crash, and we both get killed immediately. But then if we wake up or we're not in our body, you and I might be in very different places. You might be in somewhere way more advanced than me, or I might be somewhere, and it's that idea that when we drop our bodies, or as the Indians say, when we drop our bodies, we settle at a sort of frequency, if that's the right word, or a light, or a state of light, wherever we might be. But I think people have been talking about this stuff for thousands of years, haven't they? I mean, it's not anything new. But I think what is happening now is, with people having near-death experiences, then you've got all these things such as remote viewing, and serious people. It's not just they're doing all sorts of experience and all sorts of experiments with telepathy and all these kind of things that a materialist would say can't exist. But there's too much evidence for that it can't exist. I mean, if I take my own personal experiences, I was not a believer in anything, and I'm not a big fan of belief in anything. I'm a fan of experience. And of course, we can get and if you get, we live by experiences. We can be fools, but not all the time. It's interesting.
Well, Jonathan Beecher, thank you so much for sharing these stories with me and the work that you're doing. I certainly want to encourage our viewers to take a look at your book, In Time of War, Messages of Wisdom from Soldiers in the Afterlife, and to check out the catalog of White Crow books. To me, it's an amazing catalog, over 100 titles now of some of the real classics in spiritualist and mystical literature.
That's kind of you to say so, Jeffrey, and thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. I watch a lot of your shows. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being with me. It's been a pleasure.